you've got me talking about academic writing. And on what basis should I have anything to say about academic writing? I can't profess to be a wonderful, glorious, magnificent expert in academic writing. I could probably wallpaper at least one of the walls in this room with the various rejection and resubmission letters I've had from journals over the years. But I have been researching academic writing for many years. In fact, my own PhD was looking at the concept of academic literacy and literacy practices, and how it is that literacy practices come into being, and then how it is that students do or do not take on those literacy practices. So I feel relatively confident about my understanding of the literature on this topic. And on the basis of that, as I say, I'm going to chat for about 45 minutes, and I'm going to go hopefully convince you of 5 arguments, or at least put to you 5 arguments in that time. And then we'll open it more broadly. If people want to stick around, we can just take some questions off the Zoom chat, and a few people have already emailed me some questions. So what are the 5 arguments that I want to get through? Well, the first argument I'd like to put to you is that there's no such thing as academic writing. So that's the first thing I'm going to try and convince you of this afternoon. The second thing I'm going to try and convince you of, somewhat paradoxically, is that academic writing is value-laden rather than mysterious. I think for many of us, we think that the way of writing in the academy is highly mysterious. It seems to have a set of rules that are never made explicit to us. And we just sort of fake it till we make it and constantly seem to be getting them wrong. All the great mystery. I'm going to be trying to argue that, in fact, it's not so much that it's mysterious, but more that it is value-laden, that the way in which we write in the academy is based on quite a significant set of ideological principles. The third argument I'm going to put to you is that most of what seems to be mysterious, most of the seemingly mysterious aspects of academic writing are as they are for good reason. They are, in fact, based on solid, important purposes. But then I'm also going to agree with many of you that some aspects of academic writing are pretentious and exclusionary nonsense. Of course, the challenge is to tell the difference between the third and the fourth bullet. Certainly not something that we can do quite readily. The fourth thing I'm going to argue, hopefully convince you of, is that almost anyone can get good at academic writing. And in case you're suddenly worrying about that word almost in brackets and thinking, oh, maybe I'm one of those few that can't, I'm really talking here that anyone without major brain damage can get good at academic writing. I am aware that if you had significant intellectual difficulties, perhaps any form of writing may be beyond you. But I really think it's important to note that, well, I'm going to argue that IQ doesn't really come into it when it comes to good academic writing. So, of course, that means that we need to know, well, how do we get good at academic writing? I'm going to touch on a few things this afternoon, but on Thursday, we're going to pick up some really practical tasks about how one gets to become good at academic writing. I'll touch on a few today, but I'll pick up that conversation on Thursday. So let's get going with the first point. The first point I wanted to make is that there's no such thing as academic writing. And what I mean by that is that academic writing is profoundly disciplinary specific. The way in which we write is profoundly connected to what it is that we are trying to do with the writing. And in the academy, that boils down to what kind of knowledge are we trying to disseminate? What forms of knowledge are we trying to convey through our writing? And I would argue that that means that forms of academic writing are as different from each other as poetry is from plumbing instructions. Let's have a quick look at the two texts in front of us at the moment. They're both from mathematics. The text on the left is written in English, and it comes from 2014. And the text on the right is written in Greek, and some of you may recognize it, and it comes from 300 BC. So what's going on here? I just want to try and make my mouse more visible. No, that didn't work. Okay, well, I'm hoping that you can just see with my my mouse moving around here. Okay, so the one on the left in English, but if you have a look at the bottom here, where my mouse is at the moment, I mean, quite frankly, that's as Greek as you can get, as far as I'm concerned. Not only in terms of where these particular signifiers come from, but also in terms of the extent to which I can understand them. And the one on the right, the whole thing is in Greek. But quite frankly, I can probably understand just as much of the left one as I can of the right, other than the odd word, gallbladder. I've got some kind of sense of what gallbladder means. Hospitalization, oh yes, I know what that means. But really, much of this, way beyond me. And yet, I regularly participate in this activity called academic writing. So if I participate in academic writing, how is it that I can make no sense of the text in front of me? So what I thought I would do, just to underline my point a little bit longer, is I thought I'd quickly grab a few articles that have come out very recently on the topic of coronavirus, which, as you can imagine, they've come out very recently. I'm not going to read through all of them, but let's just have a quick look at some aspects of these extracts. So here's one: in order to identify SARS-CoV-2 neutralizing antibodies, ELISA cross-reactivity was assessed of antibody containing supernatants of a collection of 51 SARS-S hybridoma. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I'm lost. I'm hoping that at least one or two of you are not lost. There are words here that I understand vaguely. I've heard of immunoglobulins, kind of. I know what immunized means, I think. I've got a vague sense of antibodies, as much as any other layperson would. But the kind of knowledge that's being written here is very clearly being written for a very specialist audience. And it's assuming an enormous amount of shared knowledge. Let's move on to the next one. People with psychiatric conditions or substance use disorders, particularly those in residential treatment or inpatient facilities, are at increased risk of exposure to COVID-19, not only because of the difficulty in evaluating their medical symptoms and history, but also because of frequent patient turnover, limited space and staff, and general resource constraints in many facilities. I kind of get this one. I can follow it. I can understand what it's about. I can participate as a reader in this conversation. But to be honest, I probably am not going to get the full benefit from it. I'm glad that people are researching the vulnerability of institutionalized populations, but I suspect as I read further, this article, while being much more accessible as a field, is still going to draw on background knowledge that is probably not anything I am aware of. The third article of the four: healthcare disparities are also likely to have a role in the high burden of COVID-19 amongst ethnic racial minorities, e.g. in the USA, Black or African American minorities and Hispanic groups are less likely to have health insurance and consequent reduced healthcare access and use. Now, I can understand it. I can understand the concern. And I'm really grateful that this research is being done. But I suspect that I'm not the target audience. I suspect that this is going to be talking to, well, I'm not actually sure. I can't remember what journal this came from. But one of the things that's clear in all three of these pieces is that the author is fairly extracted. In the first one, very much so. Here, there's really no sense of a human being involved. we're talking about blood, we're talking about antibodies, we're talking about things that are by their very nature part of humans, but we're not talking about humans in terms of their fully embodied mental states and views and experiences. This one, the second one, we're talking about humans in terms of particular psychiatric and substance use disorders. Very much the people are more here. We can actually hear about, I mean, look at that very first word, people, patients. So the full human is very much visible. But I don't know much about the author. I don't really know what their views are. They seem to be caring about vulnerability of institutionalized populations. And here again, not much by way of author. Someone who's concerned about social injustices. I'm going to go on to the fourth one here from yet another journal, and it starts, I am a psychotherapist at a major hospital in rural New England. I work with individuals hospitalized for chronic and acute illnesses. In other words, I work in the business of discomfort. And she describes the discomfort of depression and anxiety that her patients have. And then she goes on to the next paragraph. I can jump to the next paragraph. She says, I can't help but reflect on the stories of my patients amid the coronavirus pandemic. I watch a sea of social media posts and so on and so on and so on. And then she ends up with how interesting that the illness, isolation, and loss that color my patients' worlds are now being woven together with our current dominant cultural narrative. We are in a collective state of discomfort. All four of those articles draw, even from the little extracts that I've got there, you can see that they're drawing from very different worlds of knowledge. They're drawing from, they're using language that is moves along a continuum from readily accessible to a broad range of disciplines to those that are very specific disciplinary knowledge. And quite honestly, I think it's important to note that they're doing different things, and so they need to use different writing styles. I am glad that all four of these articles exist, and I think that all four of them perform the job that they set out to do. I want to hear people's narratives. I want to hear their rich experiences. It helps us to understand society as made up of humans. But I also want to have those studies that are assessing antibodies and immunoglobulins and so on. So that's the first thing I wanted to say, is that there's no such thing as academic writing per se. There is rather very, very varied forms of writing that emerge from the norms and values and intentions of the discipline. Different disciplines are trying to produce different forms of knowledge, and the writing reflects that. And one is not better than the other. And even within a particular discipline, such as this one on the screen now, of psychology, you'll have very different fields of psychology, which in turn may be using different forms of writing. And then even within one aspect, subfield of a bigger field, you'll have different forms of writing. If you're writing a report or a journal article or a chapter for a book or a thesis or a postgraduate assignment. So the genre will also have a huge effect. So moving on then. Academic writing, this is my second argument, is that academic writing, I've already argued there's no such thing really, because it's multiple and it's varied and it's hugely, hugely context bound. So whenever anyone tells you academic writing should be in the third person, or academic writing should be like this or that, just remind them that they are speaking about a very specific genre within a specific field. And each discipline has its own set of values. And sometimes what we see as very mysterious ways of writing, peculiar, weird cultural phenomenons, sometimes if we get to understand what it is that that discipline is trying to do in terms of its value system, those mysteries become less mysterious. And rather they reveal the values and the intentions of the discipline. So if I have a look here, one of the problems is that I think that we often teach as if we only teach in content, but we assess as if we're assessing both the understanding of the content and the ability to explain that content within the literacy norms of the discipline. So we teach the content, but assess the content as expressed within the norms of the discipline. And I would argue that those of you in the room who are supervisors, academics, we really need to make sure that we're doing two simultaneously, that all the time we talk about content, we talk about how we express this, or why do we focus on these problems and not those? Why do we use these methods and not those? Why do we report it in this way and not that? I did a session a few weeks ago on how to analyze a journal article. You'll be able to find that on the CPGS YouTube channel. I think that's probably your best exercise if you want to try and make academic writing less mysterious for yourself. And it's an exercise that you can use with your students, those of you who are academics. So if you want to go and watch that video, it's really about taking a journal article and looking behind the curtain, look behind the mask and see what value systems are underpinning the way we do things so that it becomes less mysterious. In that table, I've kind of very, very superficially, please don't take this table as some kind of truth, because in fact, it's just a heuristic. It's just a useful image of how there are different knowledges. It's much more nuanced than this. It's not on the left-hand column or the right-hand column. In fact, there's a million different possibilities within these two columns. But just for the sake of this conversation, let's divide the entire set of knowledges that are out there and all the academic writing that is out there into these two columns. And if we do that rather crude activity, we can suggest that there's a set of knowledge that values objectivity. In other words, humans' views, values, prejudices, biases, and experiences are to the greatest extent possible kept out of the knowledge production process. And the idea is to try and find knowledge that is rule-bound so that we can identify that rule and we can see whether that rule works to explain the event each and every time. And we want that rule to be generalizable, at least within a certain area. We want to know that water boils at a certain temperature. Can we test? Does it always boil at that temperature? And so that's a particular form of knowledge. And when you're working in this kind of knowledge, you're probably going to use a set of literacy practices that would reflect that objective, rule-bound, generalizable nature of knowledge. So you'll have things like we saw in that very first extract, third person, passive voice. The solution was titrated. I don't know, I'm making up words here. The water was added. Who by? It doesn't say who by, because we're trying to keep people out of the knowledge to show that this knowledge is objective. If we have to have a subject, a person as a subject of the sentence, we would say, the researcher added the water. To make it clear that it wasn't Sue McKenna, middle-aged, white, English-speaking South African with 3 dogs sleeping in the room who added the water. No, it was the researcher. And it could be any researcher in the world, and they would come to the same conclusions. And in those kinds of texts, academic writing, the literature, the references, where there are references, would probably be in one section of the journal article or the thesis only. All the references would probably be in the section called the literature review. And this would be where we specify who else has worked in the field, and we tell you about what different studies have happened and what the findings were, and we show you what we're going to be doing. And those references are usually quite person distanced. In other words, they might be footnote references, or they might at the very most be the surname of a person in brackets. We wouldn't be likely to say, I see Murti Maestri is here, so I'll use him as an example. We might say something like, managerialism is increasing in the university, brackets, Maestri 2018. But we may be more likely to have it as a little footnote so that we keep the person, even the person's name from previous literature, we keep it out completely. And when we do talk about the literature, we're really establishing what's happened before, where are the limits, where's the gap. Whereas if we went to the right-hand column, and as I said again, said before and I'll say again, in reality, knowledge doesn't sit nicely into two columns. I'm really just doing this as extremes to try and make a point. If we look at the right-hand column and we look at the kind of knowledge where we're talking about knowledge that emerges from ideologies, from perspectives, from experiences, we acknowledge that that knowledge is subjective and that different people will take different positions on it. We acknowledge that it might be shifting, that those knowledges may come and go in different eras, in different times, in different spaces and places, different geographies. We acknowledge that that knowledge is contextual. We need to make sure that our reader has an understanding of the context if they are to understand the meaning that these people hold in this context. And so very often we will, in our literacy practices, actually use first person. I interviewed 6 academics. We're acknowledging that whatever we found from interviewing those 6 academics, and to at least some extent, will be determined by the fact that I'm the one who did the interviews. So I actually say that in my writing. I interviewed 6 academics as an example. And when we reference, we don't only reference in the literature review, we reference probably in every chapter or every section of the article or every chapter of the thesis. And that is because we're working in fields where there's so much deliberation. Why did you do interviews? Why didn't you do focus groups? Why did you do the interviews in a coffee shop? I mean, that's just one example, but basically everything is open to choice. There isn't a whole lot of shared agreement. On the left-hand side, there's shared agreement on the methodology. I'm not going to have to explain why did I boil the water. On the right-hand side, I probably do need to explain why did I only interview 6 academics. And so I will use references often to back up the choices I've made. So the references aren't only in the literature review where I show not only mapping out the literature, which is what happens on the left-hand side, but more saying these are the current conversations in the literature, the current concepts, the current theories, the current understandings. And I'll do a lot of references there, but I'll also have references even in my methodology section to justify my choices. I might have references in my findings section to show how what I found in my study relates to the subjective shifting contextual findings of other studies. And often the person is really named in those references because we're acknowledging that that literature is also made by humans and therefore subjective. We may even go so far as to name the person by their first name and say, Murti Maestri has made a convincing argument that the increased managerialism in higher education is constraining academics' activities. So we even sometimes give people their full names. That is particularly true in the humanities. And so we will also not just sort of give a clear gap as we did on the left-hand side and delimit where our study fits in, but instead we'll say, okay, this is what we found, but you know, I need to be very clear, this was the context. So because the knowledge is different, the literacy practices are different. And so nobody can teach you the literacy practices of your discipline other than someone who's already fully a member of that discipline. And sadly, when you become fully a member of a discipline, it's a little bit like a fish not knowing that it's in water because it's so all around it. The academics that are so imbued in their disciplines and so used to writing in their disciplines start to believe that they're just writing ordinary common sense English or whatever other language it is, but it is typically English, which is another discussion which we could go into maybe in the question and answer time. So there's a problem that people outside who want to run workshops, as I'm doing now, on how to do academic writing, well, they're lying because they can't, because there's no such thing as academic writing. It differs fundamentally from discipline to discipline and genre to genre. And people who are fully on the inside often aren't able to explain to you the norms and values of the academic writing because to them it's obvious. So having said that, I do think as academics who are fully on the inside, we need to try and teach them in ways that make the literacy practices and its connection to the knowledge more explicit. But I also think that as students, we can try and do more and more reading at a kind of meta level where we read an article for the content first, and then we go back and try and make sense, as I did in that previous session, on how that author used references and used argument and used claims and used evidence to build their article. And when we can start to unpick other people's articles, then we can kind of crack the code and go, it's not so mysterious after all. So we need to read at a meta level as well as reading just for the content. We need to look behind the curtain. The fourth thing I said I wanted to do this afternoon was to argue, which is quite a difficult challenge to argue, that most aspects of academic writing are there for a good reason. And I just happened to choose this picture. I Googled E = MC squared, because I thought, well, what's something that everyone knows as a formula, but no one really understands? There may well be someone in this group that understands it, but I would like to suggest that most of us have heard of E = MC squared, but we know it's something to do with mass, energy, time, space, equivalence. Well, I'm hoping some of you can do better than me. But unless you're really in the field, when I Googled E = MC squared, this was the first image that came up under Google Images. Really? I mean, I understand the words. I understand the word future, light, cone, time. Okay, hypersurface, I'm not so sure about. But every other word there, I understand. Simple English. Do I understand the graphic? Not a clue. So the writing about that graphic is probably going to leave me in its dust. I'm probably not going to understand it. And I don't think that that's a bad thing, because when someone's writing about this graphic, they're not writing for me. They're writing for dissemination of the knowledge for those working in that field. I sometimes hear people say, academic writing, all this fancy jargon. And I'm going to get on to the point just now that sometimes it is indeed jargon. But let's also bear in mind that disciplines and interdisciplinary studies, and that we can also chat about if there's time, that disciplines emerge over years and years and years, and they not only emerge in terms of their norms and values and therefore their literacy practices, but actually their knowledge base. And if you were working at the cutting edge of that field, if you were making a contribution at the absolute frontier of that field, it's unlikely that the conversations you're going to be having and the conversations you're going to be writing and disseminating are going to be readily accessible to every person. Some disciplines are less accessible than others, but when you're really working at the frontier of a field, whatever field it is, whether it's sociology or social work or physics or whatever it may be, it's unlikely when you're really working at that frontier that the academic writing you do is going to be readily understandable by an aunt or uncle of yours that is not in the field, or sister or brother or whatever. And that's important because we need to move the field forward. So we can't be constantly explaining the basics that took 12 years to get to the point where we can actually make a contribution. So when people say to me, I actually had someone come to me and say, you know, I want to do a PhD. They were a chemistry lecturer, and they said, I want to do a PhD with you guys in higher education studies, which is the field that I work in. So we are in universities, researching universities. I know that can sound rather navel-gazing, but my research is on universities. And they said, I'd like to do a PhD in higher education studies. I'd like, I've been teaching for years. I'd like to research. I'd like to research teaching practice. I said, okay, great, that sounds good. Tell me a bit more. And they said, well, I don't want to do a PhD though with all your fancy long language, all that ontology, epistemology, stuff, really. I just want to write like a really accessible PhD. And anyway, this was a chemistry lecturer. So I said to her, now tell me, when you have, you teach honours, eh? She said, yeah. I said, so when you have honours students, do you ever take in any honours students who say, I want to do a chemistry honours, but I just don't want to deal with any of those, fancy chemistry formula stuff, please, let's just make it simple, straightforward chemistry. Well, yeah, the bottom line is that the further and further you work in a discipline, yes, there will be aspects of the conversations around that discipline that become increasingly the purview of specialists in the discipline only. Now, yeah, and the semantic, what we call semantic density, using legitimation code theory. Semantic density is when more and more concepts can be condensed into fewer and fewer words. So let's go back to that example of E equals MC squared. Now, the notion of squared and the notion of equals is probably more or less accessible to most of us that did maths sometime in our distant past. But the notion of E and MC and how those get multiplied so that they are equal, that probably requires levels of cumulative knowledge over many, many years. So when we look at academic writing and we dismiss it as being, oh, it's just fancy, highfalutin academics, they're just irritating in their fanciness, be careful of just dismissing it. I can look back and think of some of the things I dismissed when I was starting out that I saw as pretentious. Maybe it's just that I've been so acculturated I've become pretentious too. I hope not. But I think it's also that I've become to understand that knowledge more, and I've understood how those concepts, how the semantic, the mass of meaning can be condensed into a term, and how important that is. And that's why when you're starting out in a field, you might use terms quite loosely, and you might have a supervisor who pulls you up and says, oh, what do you mean by discourse? And you go like, oh, I don't know, like discourse, like, you know, talking about stuff. Well, no, discourse has a very specific meaning in the academy, and different meanings in different fields. So you need to be very clear that you're using that term precisely. But it's not only terminology, it's also value systems, it's also our grammar. All of these things emerge from what we're trying to do. In some disciplines, the context might be almost invisible. That the example of E equals MC squared, the example of that illustration on the right, the context is almost invisible. Where the research happened, who the researcher was, that might not be expressed. The researcher decisions might be almost invisible. In other fields, the context of the research is highly visible, and it needs to be made visible because it has a huge implication for the knowledge claims being made. In some fields, there are so many contestations around methodology and around theory use and around the way in which findings are reached that the researcher needs to make herself very visible and to articulate how she made these decisions and to draw on the literature or other means to substantiate the decisions all the way through. Now, I'm not suggesting that everything we write should be fancy and semantically dense and completely out of the reach of other people. As many of you who know me know, I speak a lot about the need for academics to participate in public media, for academics to take our complex knowledge and translate it into ways that can be published in the press and shared over radio and run through workshops and used in communities. I feel that if we don't spend time translating our work into processes that can be understood by people outside the discipline, we're actually doing a disservice. We are part of the problem of why there's such an anti-intellectualism in the world today. And we're part of the problem of why people are saying, why should we be spending money on universities? So we need to do that work of translating our complex knowledge into ways that make it accessible and meaningful for the ordinary person. But doing that definitely loses a lot of the semantic density. And you have to, I don't think we can deny that writing for the newspaper requires a translation into a much more accessible way that loses a lot of the nuance. I think it's important to do that, but we can talk about that another day. So, having tried to argue that a lot of the way in which we write, which is discipline specific, emerges with good reason from the intentions of that field, I will acknowledge that there are some aspects that are pretentious and exclusionary nonsense that have just become so much the norm of a discipline that they are used to exclude and refuse publications, that they are blinkers that stop us from seeing things. As Foucault said, our disciplines discipline us. They allow us, our disciplines are sets of lenses that allow us to see the world in very specialized ways and allow us to make contributions to the world at the frontier of the field. But they can also prevent us from seeing things happening in the discipline right next door, or that can also prevent us from seeing that some of our norms and values are actually more historical than valuable. All I would like to really, really encourage all of you is to never fall into the trap of dismissing before you've tried to understand. When you've understood, you may now start to change your views about whether it's worth dismissing, or you may, and I urge you to go ahead and do this, you may actually challenge the discipline. Disciplines need challenging, they need shaking up. We need people to be able to talk across disciplines much more to cope with the wicked problems of the world. But I just am aware that oftentimes when people complain about academic writing as being exclusionary, they simply haven't done very much reading and writing in that field or on that topic themselves. So, moving along rapidly, almost anyone can get good at academic writing. I would like to absolutely convince every single one of you that you can all be truly excellent academic writers. I'm not saying you're going to achieve it today. I haven't achieved it yet. I don't think you ever achieve it in the sense of I've got there. But I would like to argue that it's something that is achievable. I had a PhD student many years ago. I often mention her, Sarah Reddy, because of a particular conversation we had many, many years ago. So Sarah was a full-time academic and doing her PhD with me, and she was also a runner. And so she would train in the morning, get up and do her training runs, and she ran all the races you can think of. Comrades, Two Oceans, everything. Serious marathon runner. And I can once remember, I can't remember my exact wording, but I said something like, wow, it's so amazing, you know, it's incredible that you, this incredible long distance runner. It's amazing. And she said, well, no, it's not really amazing. I mean, I get up every morning at 4 o'clock and I go running. And I have a coach who helps me with my gait and my stride. And I have good running shoes. But mostly, I get up every morning. I get up when it's raining. I get up when it's cold. I get up when it's dark. I get up when it's clear. I get up when I feel like it. I get up when I don't feel like it. And I run. And I run every day. And she said to me, and you too could run the comrades if you wanted to. Now, luckily, I didn't take her seriously on that last part. I'm not quite convinced that every one of us can be a comrades marathon runner. But those words have really stuck with me because it strikes me that we have a similar misconception about academic writing. And I often hear people saying, I'm good at academic writing, or actually much more often I hear people saying, yeah, but I'm really bad at academic writing. Well, how much academic writing have you done? Because if you haven't done very much academic writing, of course you suck at academic writing. If you've done lots of academic writing, of course you're good at academic writing. I am much better at academic writing now than I was 10 years ago. I can write an article quicker. I can read an article quicker. Throw me into a new field and I go back 100 steps. If I have to start reading on a new topic, if I have to move into, and I'm working in a couple of interdisciplinary projects at the moment, and I'm having to read articles outside my field that people in the project team are saying, this is really accessible, read this one. I'm still going, what? This isn't accessible, it's written in Greek, help me. So you definitely go backwards if you're moving across, because there's no such thing as academic writing, remember? So, but it is something you get better and better at. And I am better at it than I used to be. But when I go away on a writing retreat with my colleague Chrissy Bowie, and we're both sitting down and writing, and we meet up at lunchtime on the evening, we say how our day went, she will always have managed to make breakthroughs and written more than I have. And I found that quite nice, actually, quite reassuring that I've got a ways to go. that I'm going to get better. I have got better and I will get better. It's not always easy. Please don't ever misquote me. Academic writing is often very tough. I can hit an article where I know what argument I want to make and I just can't seem to put the structure together in a convincing way. I often hit a dead wall. As I said, I often will be faced with rejection, but I know that I can do it better than when I was doing my master's or my PhD. So that's my bottom line argument, is that you can get good at academic writing, but sad to say, there's only one way to get good at academic writing, and that's through academic writing. So it's a social practice. That's what I've been arguing so far. What I mean by that doesn't necessarily mean that you need to be together in a room or doing pomodoros as we run on Mondays and Friday afternoons. It doesn't mean that you have to be social in that sense, although I'm a firm believer that I get a lot more writing done when I am sitting doing focused writing with others around me doing focused writing. I don't mean it's social in that way though. I mean it's social in the sense that it isn't just common sense. It isn't something that's neutral. It, as I've been arguing, it actually emerges from the histories of that discipline. So to become good at a social practice, you need to understand the social aspect of it. You need to really delve into the articles on the phenomenon that you're interested in. Make sense of how others are talking about this phenomenon. Make sense of the methodologies that they are using, because you're joining a conversation. It's social. The conversation around your phenomenon or in your field has been going on for many, many, many years. So in order to become good at academic writing, you need to participate in that social group by reading, and finding out what are people thinking, saying, doing. You do not have to agree with them. You do not have to duplicate their methodologies. You can challenge, but you are joining a conversation. You can't just walk into a room and start talking. You need to spend some time figuring out who's in the room and what are they saying before you contribute. So that's the social aspect. And then the practice aspect. A lot of people talk about writing skills. I hate the word skills. For me, skills are something that you can achieve. You can go to a workshop and you can get the skills, and you can get a certificate saying that you've got the skills, that you can now do this particular kind of coding or use this particular machine. Practice is not something you ever get. As I said, I've got better, but I have a ways to go, and I often have to go back and get worse again because I'm trying something new or I'm working in a new area. It's a practice, and that can be a verb or a noun. So it's a practice in the sense that it's something that you do, you perform, and it's a practice in the sense that you end up with this written text. But because it's a practice, you have to practice it. It's not something you can get, and it's certainly not something you are born with. Thankfully, no one was born being good at writing in philosophy or physics. It's not a language skill. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this because I know this is a hugely controversial issue, and it's one that I think needs a whole workshop on its own. But just two quick provisos. The one is, if you are writing in a language, in other words, the medium of your writing is a language that is not your mother tongue, it is harder. There is no two ways about that. If you are extremely fluent in a particular language, here we talk about language as a medium, and then you are writing in a language that is not that medium, in a medium that is not that language you speak at home, it is harder. But as Bourdieu and Passeron said, academic writing is no one's mother tongue. And so it's important to note that just because you're good at language won't mean that you're good at academic writing, because it's only when you become good at the norms and values, when you understand the conversations, when you get what are the core concepts, when you can take a position on which methodology you approve of and why, or which you want to try out and why, or which you don't agree with and why. It's when you can participate in that conversation that you will be good at academic writing, far more than being good at spelling and grammar and punctuation. I'll even go so far as to say that artificial intelligence is rapidly figuring out how to fix our spelling, grammar, and punctuation. And if the computer can't do it for you, you can pay someone to do it, because there are plenty of proofreaders out there. far more important that you spend the time thinking through what are the concepts you want to communicate with your reader. Have you understood the concept yourself? Are you thinking about your reader when you try and express that concept? Are you expressing it in a way that will make sense to them? Are you connecting different sections of your writing in a way that the reader won't think, oh, what's she talking about now? Why she jumped to this new topic? That's not about spelling, grammar, and punctuation. That is about academic writing, coherence, golden thread, disciplinary concepts, all of that stuff. You can be really good at language and still not be particularly good at academic writing, and vice versa. If you are really imbued in a field and you understand the concepts and you can participate in that conversation, it's not the end of the world if your sentence structure is a bit off. And I don't want to spend too much time, but speaking to the supervisors in the room, if you are spending hours and hours and hours correcting your students' spelling, grammar, and sentence structure, especially on the first couple of drafts, you are wasting your time and you're paralyzing their writing, because until they are participating in the conversation, until they've got the concepts, until they've got the coherence, you're really just polishing a piece of text that is probably not that coherent. Get the coherence first and then help your students tackle the language and spelling and grammar errors, or let the computer do it, or pay for someone else to do it. Yeah, so anyone can get good at academic writing, but it does take so the good news, I mean, it's good news, bad news stuff. The good news is you might be sitting with imposter syndrome right now. I'm not clever enough. I'm not good enough. They're going to find out sooner or later. They're going to figure out that I shouldn't even be in this course. I don't have the intelligence, whatever that voice in your head is saying, because believe you me, we all have those voices. If you don't know what I'm talking about, imposter syndrome, Google it. If you don't have it, good for you. But most of us have imposter syndrome to some extent. Some of it have it to an almost crippling extent. If you have almost crippling levels of self-doubt, you're probably not going to believe me, but I really wish you would. Any of you can be good academic writers. Every single one of you listening right now. But it takes a lot of effort and practice, 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 practice. One of the key things, and this is what I call a cultural issue, using Margaret Archer. Margaret Archer distinguishes between structure, and culture to her as the realm of ideas and values. And for me, we spend far too much time with our students worrying about throughput and completion and performance, performativity, and not enough time talking about the real beauty of the academy, which is about knowledge and contestation and debates and contributions. And I really urge all of you, when you're thinking about your writing, to think about it as contributing knowledge. Don't think about writing a thesis or a chapter or getting a publication. Oh, I've got to get a publication. For heaven's sakes, there are enough publications in the world already. I could read this whole lockdown every day, all day, and I still wouldn't catch up with all the publications that are already out there in my field. So please don't rush to get a publication. And don't rush to write a thesis, but do rush to be part of the conversation that contributes knowledge, because that is what we need. And it might sound a little bit iffy, like you're thinking, what's the difference? I would like to suggest that the difference is enormous, that if you can genuinely convince yourself that yes, maybe some of you are complete novices and you feel like you're on the edges of the conversation, but if you can convince yourself that this conversation is worth participating in, that it's worth pushing through that complicated reading, it's worth writing notes for yourself to figure out what you think. If you can convince yourself that that is a worthy time spent, and it'll allow you to participate in a conversation that is vibrant and exciting and meaningful, I think it's going to sustain your long journey to good academic writing far better. And I think this might be my last point, and that is this: the way to good writing is through bad writing. There are no shortcuts. If you aren't prepared to write badly, you simply can't write well. I think too many of us sit with that judgment, and we sit down and we pick up our pen and we put our fingers to the keyboard and we expect to write in beautiful full sentences, coherent texts, wonderful arguments from the get-go. And that stops us actually from getting anything done because we're constantly judging ourselves. We're editing each sentence as we write it, instead of just trying to get it down badly, messily, and then read it through and think, well, is there a little nub of something worthwhile here? How can I express that better? You've got to go through the bad writing. You can't get to good writing if you're not willing to do lots and lots of bad writing. So don't judge yourself as saying, wow, this is absolutely useless. Rather say, yay, one step of useless closer towards good writing. And there's usually something, some nub of something worthwhile in any piece of useless. So I think I've said this enough. I really want to urge you to think of it as joining a conversation. You can challenge the conversation, you can contribute to the conversation. And remember, you only have to make a contribution. In South Africa, the Higher Education Qualifications Sub-Framework says that a PhD is a contribution at the frontiers of a discipline or field. I love that word, contribution. Whenever anyone tells me a PhD is new knowledge, I feel terrified and say, well, thank goodness I've already got my PhD, because the idea of making new knowledge is enormous. But a contribution, that sounds more doable. I've got to make sense of the conversation. What are people saying about this phenomenon? What are the current thinking? Then I look at my data if I'm doing an empirical study and I say, is there something here? Something. Doesn't have to be a Nobel Prize, but something that people haven't said, or some way of seeing this phenomenon that perhaps hasn't been seen. A contribution can be a small thing, but it needs to add to current thinking. And then another little catchphrase I always say to my own students, for every reading, there must be a writing. You're joining a conversation, so you need to find out what is the conversation. What are the current thinking, concepts, ideas? And also reading at a meta level to say, how did this author structure the methodology section? How did this author structure the founding section? Have a look at how that author used references, or what went into an abstract for this journal. So you're wanting to figure out how other people are participating in the conversation. But in doing that, in reading extensively, make sure you're doing writing. I always say for every reading, there must be a writing. Now, that's not a writing for someone else's eyes. It's not a writing that you hand into your supervisor. It's a writing for yourself. Keep a reading journal. Scribble for yourself notes, not to summarize and highlight and pull out the key phrases, but just to jot down, oh, I didn't understand this reading. I love this reading. This is what I liked about this reading. This reading reminds me of that other reading. That point in this reading is going to be important for my study in this way. Keep notes for yourself, because that process of translating from someone else's voice into your own thoughts of what that reading means for you will really help you to have your own voice in your own writing. There's a whole lot of stuff on this slide. All of it's from the postgradenvironments.com website. Those are all videos, short little videos, anything from 2 minutes to about 8 minutes. And they really cover a lot more than what I've spoken about today, how to write an argument. The first one, just write, is really all about this idea that if you aren't willing to write badly, you won't be able to write well, and gives you some ideas of how to structure your bad writing before you get to the good writing.